right, thank you, Aileen. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We are excited to welcome Congresswoman Grace Meng from New York's 6th District to help us kick off Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. My name is Corey Lemke. I currently serve as the International Treasurer for Democrats Abroad, and I'm a member of the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus. I live in Seoul, South Korea, and I vote in Tucson, Arizona. We hope that everyone on this call is using their voice by voting and has already requested their ballot for the upcoming midterms. Remember, US citizens abroad must request a ballot once every calendar year, so make sure you do this today if you haven't already. Just visit votefromabroad.org. With just a little over 6 months to go until the November midterms, and we are grateful to all of our volunteers that are working to get out the vote. We would also like to add that if you would like to make a donation to help us reach voters abroad, you can do so on our website, and that's www.democratsabroad.org/AAPI-donations. And if someone could put that in the chat box for me there, thanks. We thank our special guest, Congresswoman Meng, and all our attendees for joining us today and look forward to a stimulating conversation. And with that, I'll hand this over to Emily, the chair of the Global AAPI Caucus, who will now introduce our featured speaker. Take it away, Emily.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you to everyone that's tuning in today. On behalf of Democrats Abroad AAPI Caucus, we are grateful to Congresswoman Meng for taking the time on a Sunday morning to speak with us. I'm Emily Lyons. I have the honor of being the chair of the AAPI Caucus for Democrats Abroad, and I'm also the vice chair of Democrats Abroad Germany. I'm located here in Berlin, Germany, and I vote in Indiana. The Democrats Abroad AAPI Caucus was officially established in June 2020. So this is the second year that we're getting the chance to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month, and we're very excited that we get to kick things off this way. I just want to introduce Congresswoman Meng before we turn the floor to her. She is the U.S. representative for New York's 6th District, and she is the first vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. She has been a member of Congress since 2013, and previously she represented the 22nd District in the New York State Assembly from 2009 until 2012. Congresswoman Meng was born in Elmhurst, Queens, and raised in the Bayside and Flushing sections of the borough. She graduated from the University of Michigan and earned a law degree from Yeshiva University's Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. She is the first Asian American elected to Congress from New York and the first female Congress member from Queens since former vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro. I would like to now hand it over to Congresswoman Meng to hear her thoughts about the importance of the upcoming midterms, especially the need to get out the AAPI vote. Congresswoman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Corey, and everyone who helped put together this event. This is so important and probably long overdue, so thank you for taking the reins over that. I want to acknowledge leadership at the DNC, Chairman Harrison, and our AAPI Caucus Chair in general, Bell Yang Hong. I know that they constantly talk about the need for more AAPI caucuses in our states and territory, and of course that includes Dems abroad as well. So thank you for your incredible leadership. I'm thrilled to be able to be here with all of you to celebrate APA Heritage Month. I'd like to say good morning, but I know you are all over the globe. I have no idea what time of the day it is for many of you. But thank you for including me. You know, I never thought, honestly, growing up that I would ever be involved in politics. My parents were immigrants to this country in the early 70s. They worked in a restaurant for most of my childhood and later on became a restaurant owner themselves. You know, a story that is not that different from so many AAPIs or Americans from wherever around the globe they first came from. Never thought that I would go into politics. I was actually a really shy kid. You know, never ran for student government, never even took a political science class. It's a complete list of what not to do if you want to run for office. I speak to high school and college kids sometimes, and I even tell them that they have more political experience than I did when I first ran for office. But we have seen how important it is to make sure that our voices are heard. AAPI Heritage Month means a lot to me as an Asian American who was born and raised in the United States, who, like many of you, may have grown up feeling that we were not as American or as accepted as other Americans. I grew up really self-conscious about my race. I grew up at a time in New York when there weren't that many Asian Americans in my classes, in my neighborhood. Always remembering things like begging my mom not to give me Chinese food for lunch, that I just wanted a sandwich, just like all the other kids. But have really, especially in the last 2 years, come to appreciate and honor the history and the experiences of our AAPI community. I think what we've seen in the last few years is the recognition, not just by people within our own community, but people in other communities too, that Asian Americans are just as American as anyone else. And our stories and our experiences might sound a little different from those of our neighbors sometimes, but that doesn't mean that we have any less to do with how we as a community have contributed to this country. These past 2 years have been really difficult for our community, especially. I mean, of course, everyone's been going through this global pandemic. But our AAPI community has, on top of the pandemic, gone through just a spike in incidents of bias, hate, and violence to the point of death in many cases, especially in my hometown of New York. And while we certainly understand that discrimination against Asian Americans is nothing new in this country, but the numbers really skyrocketed after the former president and other leaders in this country who had a wide platform kept using words that literally put a bullseye on the back of our community, and often the most vulnerable, our youth, our elderly, and AAPI women. And so that's why it's so important for us to gather like this, even if it's just virtually. And in some ways, sometimes, especially with this crowd, it might be easier to do virtually. And I just want to make sure that we're doing this periodically. Please use me as a resource. It's easy, as much as I'd love to travel to visit you all in person one day. We must make sure that one thing I realized during COVID is that we have to strengthen our national or international network. There are too many Asian Americans who don't know about the Democratic Party. They might not know the difference between Democrats and Republicans because no one's ever reached out to them. And so it is a passion of mine that we must do everything we can to reach out to our communities who are in large AAPI communities, and especially those who are not, may not have resources like this available. And so, as we talk about AAPI hate, last year, we passed, President Biden signed our COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law. This is a part of the solution. We as a community were really honored because it's one of the few times where a president or national leadership has shown recognition and empathy to what was happening to our community. I remember we had a hearing in Judiciary Committee about this issue, and so many of us, whether members or staffers or just everyday people watching the hearings, were just so touched and blown away, because when's the last time we had a congressional hearing about issues that impacts our community so heavily? And so the Hate Crimes Act was signed into law. It is just one piece of the multifaceted solution. Our community is wide and diverse, and the solutions are diverse. There is not one simple slogan or bill that is going to solve this problem overnight. And so, you know, we worked on the Hate Crimes Act. We also have to make sure that we are investing in our social infrastructure programs like social and mental health services for victims, their families, our community, and even the perpetrators are so desperately needed. In my home city of New York, over half of the attacks were perpetrated by people with prior record of mental health issues. And so this is not only AAPI month, but it's also, I believe, Mental Health Awareness Month. And so there's no better time to put actions and money behind our words than now. We also, in the long term, I strongly believe, need to work on education. There are too many people, I don't have to tell this audience, that look at us and always, right, ask us where we're from, where we learned to speak English. As an adult who was born and raised in New York City, such a diverse area, I still get asked that pretty often. And so there's still a constant misperception and stereotype that we have to overcome in this country, and remind people that we have been here for a long time and our ancestors literally helped build this country. And so we're working on issues like with many state legislators as well, expanding our curriculum in schools so that everyday students, AAPI and beyond, are taught how Asian Americans contributed to this country, the trauma that our community has faced in this country. We want it all, the good and the bad. We also are working to establish a first national AAPI museum in our nation's capital. The first step of this was passed via legislation just a few days ago in Congress. And so that's something that I hope will be a relatively short process. I have no idea. People were like, oh, when can I go? I'm like, we're not there yet. People are offering to donate their items. But, it just kind of also is exciting because it shows the excitement that, people want other people to know about our place in this country. And so it is really exciting. And I'm happy to take questions, but I will end with the reminder of how important it is for us to reach out to Asian Americans for the elections. A few years ago, I got involved in the DNC and I ran for one of the vice chair spots. And honestly, it's not something that I necessarily thought that I would ever do. But I realized, towards the weeks headed towards the Trump-Hillary election, that I was seeing, multilingual outreach from the Republicans to our communities, from battleground states to places like New York. And I was really worried about that. And part of the reason why I got involved in the DNC was that I just feel like we are leaving too many stones unturned. And even to this day, the Republicans have opened, I believe, 30 some, I don't know what they call it, family or service centers in largely minority areas, trying to reach out. I know that they have started doing phone banks in some elections where they think the AAPI community could make a difference. And Asian Americans have already made a difference in elections. I believe we had a strong role in making sure that President Biden won the White House last 2 years ago, my goodness. When we look at the numbers from 2016, in every state almost every state that Hillary lost, AAPIs, the number of eligible AAPI voters were larger than the margin of loss that Democrats had. And so I'm really proud of the work that AAPI grassroots organizations did, sometimes with the help of local Democratic leaders and sometimes without. But making sure that we were mobilizing our own communities, getting information out in different languages, meeting voters where they are. And in many cases, Georgia is a great example of learning from and working with other underrepresented communities as well. I've gone to, during my time at the DNC, I went to 20 some states and really got to see this type of coalition building, not just in places like Georgia, but even Iowa, Arkansas, right? So there's a lot of potential. We're the fastest growing community in this country. We are everywhere, right? And so we really have to make sure we're doing everything we can to reach out. That engagement is so crucial. And as we've seen in the last few years, that engagement will literally help save lives. So, you know, I wanted to be here to congratulate you all for putting together this caucus, to offer my support. Please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be helpful, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much. And also congratulations on the bill that was passed last week about the museum. I'm sure we'll have plenty of people once you're ready to start collecting material that can send you some items for the museum. I think that's great with what you just kind of ended with, and I'd like to turn it over to Eric to ask our first question that ties in very well with that. Eric?
Yeah, I'm really happy you were talking about voting initiatives and how important it is to reach out to the AAPI community. As we know, AAPI voters played a huge role in the 2020 elections. Many AAPI voters in some states, for example, Georgia, my home state, actually where I was born, have relied on early voting, absentee ballots, drop-off ballots, etc. Restrictive voting legislation that has been implemented in some states may severely affect voters who have relied on them. Could you comment on how voter assistance can be best addressed, particularly in these restrictive states?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been really disappointing and quite frankly racist to see so many of these bills being introduced and even passed at the state legislative levels. And your hometown of Georgia is one of the prime examples, unfortunately. You know, this sounds cliche, but it's so important. We in Congress, in the Senate specifically, still have to make sure that we are trying to pass, you know, voting rights reform. In the few conversations that I've had with election and voting rights attorneys, they're pretty much saying like that is the one thing that is needed to make sure that people's right to vote is preserved. And that is not off the table. I know it's been really, really frustrating to watch, but it is, you know, the laws that are being passed in places like Georgia, like I think some of them are like, you can't vote, you can't do early vote on the Sunday right before election day, but you can vote early vote on other days. You can't, you know, give someone a bottle of water if they're waiting in line. You take away polling places in other states, in some of the more dense and large minority represented areas. I mean, these laws are blatantly racist and restrictive. So on the legislative side, that's what, you know, we still have to do. But it is important. One thing that is important, I think, anecdotally, at the very least, is to make sure that we are reaching out and making ourselves as a party and community groups available to collect some of these stories, testimonies that might be happening. As people are going to vote, as early vote is happening in some of these states this year, we need to make sure that people know, you know, where to call, who to reach out to if something is happening like in real time. That is not a large scale fix, but for certain elections in certain districts and states, that is very important and may very well affect the outcome of an election. And so, you know, I know that some organizations have set up multilingual hotlines, for example, or they distribute cards with the phone number, like, you know, please call this number if you feel like you're being turned away. And so, you know, that's sort of a short-term specific area type of fix, but, you know, we got to do what we can before we pass the legislation.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to check on your time, if you had time for maybe one more question. Great. Okay, Nick, do you want to ask? We have a question actually from the chat. I think maybe if you want to ask.
Wait, which question in particular are you referring to?
The question that came from Paula that first came in.
You mean the one on, it would be good to kind of how Democrats are strategizing for the upcoming elections?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the question in effect. You know, like, how are Democrats thinking about the upcoming elections, especially in a country that seems to be much more, at first glance, to be much more divided politically? Kind of how are Democrats thinking about the strategy of energizing their own voters, reaching out to other voters, independents? Just kind of what's the thought process?
So I can give my 2 cents and my perspective, what I am working on and what I think needs to be worked on. I'm not officially with the DNC anymore, but I think that one of the important things that we worked on during the time that I was there was literally reaching out to every community in every state and territory, including Democrats abroad. I know that sounds very cliche, but Democrats have not always done that in the past. I remember when I first joined in 2017, it was the first national election post-Trump, and Eric will know, obviously, from Georgia, John Ossoff was running for the House, for Congress. And the DNC worked, they gave money to the local state party, and then they worked together to hire organizers from the local communities who spoke the languages, who knew the communities, instead of, you know, what has been done in the past sometimes, hiring people with impressive sounding resumes, you know, from an area that but people who are outsiders who don't know much about, you know, those neighborhoods or those districts. So I think that that is very important. And, you know, building up voter mobilization is something that needs to happen, not just right before election day. It can't just start October, you know, September, right before election day. It has to be a year-round operation. People are very smart. They know when you approach them only for the purpose of getting their vote and then disappear for the months and the years in between. And that's not okay. And so making sure that our party at the national to local levels are investing is important. Where one of the other hats I wear, I'm the head of Aspire, which is the political arm of the Asian Caucus in Congress. And what we've done in the last 2 cycles is give some money to areas where there are growing AAPI populations, but we don't feel like there's enough attention on getting out the AAPI vote. States like Texas, Georgia, Virginia, New Jersey, for example, we have tried to continuously encourage them and to try to support them in small ways, but hopefully growing ways, to encourage them to get out the vote. And it's interesting because one of those states, you know, we don't give that much money every year, but one of those states actually reached out a couple of months ago and they were like, oh, should we hire an AAPI organizer? I'm like, yes. Like, and so they wanted to do this year round. So I'm just gonna take that as progress. But a third thing that I think is really important that I don't think we're doing well enough is we have this Biden administration that has passed amazing legislation. But we also have done polling in AAPI and Latino communities in certain parts of the country, for example. In one part, there was a poll with Latino voters, and 70% of them never heard of the infrastructure bill, right? So we can't be serious in touting our legislative accomplishments when 70% of any community doesn't know what we're doing. So one thing that, you know, I'm working on is to make sure that both candidates and elected officials are reaching out and talking about this legislation, not just as a large, you know, bipartisan infrastructure package, but we have to talk about it in a way that people feel like their lives are improved. It's like even here in New York City, in Queens, if I just say infrastructure, that really doesn't mean anything to anyone. But they want to know if their wait times for the trains and buses are going to decrease, if there's sewers that flooded during the recent Hurricane Ida that ruined their homes and wiped out their savings, if that is going to be fixed, right? So we have to say things and express things in ways that make people understand and feel, right? Democrats are really good at what's happening here, but not always doing enough at getting to the heartstrings and helping people understand why we did something and how it will help them. And so that's something that I think we need to do a better job at, whether it's campaigns, whether it's working through the agencies, the various agencies, and like their marketing and ad budget, for example, is something that I'm working on with the Black and Latino Caucus to make sure that we're literally getting the word out, because we might accuse Republicans of not sharing our values, sharing the values that so many in our communities hold. But guess what? While they literally push legislation that hurt and kills our communities, they are pumping out their information in multiple languages and making them feel like they care, right? And I'll leave you with this, why messaging is important. A few years ago, when the former president was separating children, babies, and parents at the border, I went to the border, and I remember one conversation I had with one of the moms. She didn't say, oh, why is Trump doing this? She said, why is your country, why is America separating us from our babies, right? So we're all here in America and abroad, understanding fully that it was a Trump era policy. But certain communities, and granted she was coming from another country, but certain communities, and we can say the same thing about issues in Puerto Rico, because when I went to Puerto Rico after Maria, I heard the same thing. People don't attribute it or necessarily know that it's the Republicans to blame. So that just shows me that we have to do a much more effective job at authentically reaching out to people. Not everyone's watching MSNBC or reading our mainstream papers. Are we also investing in local radio, ethnic media outlets, agricultural newsletters? These are all things that we need to do more of.
Thank you so much. I know you have a really busy schedule, so we don't want to keep you too much longer. So thank you for spending time with us this morning. And yeah, please know how much we really appreciate this, that you took the time out to help us kick off a Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So thank you so much.
Good luck, everyone.
Thank you. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us on the call today. We also appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday to be here. Please remember, we do have more events lined up to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month. This includes an event this coming Friday with Sungyeon Choi-Moro from the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. We'll also be having an event on May 19th with Grace Shimizu and Brian Nia on remembering the legacy of Japanese American incarceration. And on Saturday, May 28th, we'll be speaking with Diego Sanchez from PFLAG, who will help us transition into Pride Month starting in June. You can find more information about these events on our website, so please follow the link in the chat box to find out more about these and other AAPI Caucus events. We'd love to have everyone there. In closing, I would like to give a big shout out to Eileen Dinnan, who provided technical support today. Also, thank you to Eric, Nick, and Corey for being here to ask questions and to help moderate the event. And thank you again to everyone on our Democrats Abroad teams. And if anyone's interested in getting involved, which we would appreciate everyone's help with, you can send us an email at aapi@democratsabroad.org. You can also visit our website to make a financial donation so that we can continue to bring more events like these to Americans around the world. Every little bit helps, so thank you in advance for any donations that you can make. And last but not least, do not forget to request your ballot by going to votefromabroad.org today. For now, we'll say goodbye and close the call. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all next time.